Big companies, whether they make video games or not, have a tendency to get sued. Sometimes these are frivolous lawsuits courtesy of weirdos. Sometimes they're class actions when a company gets it wrong in a major way. And sometimes, a child and his mother sue Nintendo over JoyCon Drift. You heard that right. A mother and her young child sued Nintendo because of their total inability to adequately address the biggest hardware problem in games since the Xbox 360's Red Ring of Death, JoyCon Drift. While Nintendo has, to some extent, acknowledged the issue and taken steps to address it, it hasn't been enough. Today, we're going to take a look at how and why a child sued Nintendo over the controllers on their Switch console. And we're going to examine the JoyCon Drift issue and why it's still a major problem today. If you haven't heard the phrase JoyCon Drift before, don't worry. The situation isn't great, but it isn't all that complicated either. Since the launch of the original Nintendo Switch in 2017, and through all the refreshes of the mainline Switch console, JoyCon Drift has plagued Switch owners. In short, over time, Switch owners report that the analog sticks on their Joy-Cons randomly input commands to the console, even when they're not being physically moved around. This problem tends to affect left Joy-Con controllers, which are traditionally used for movement, more so than right Joy-Con controllers. But the problem is pervasive. Many Switch owners report drifting issues on both Joy-Cons and even on replacement Joy-Cons as well. However, there are not exact reports and exact numbers for users experiencing Joy-Con drift issues in comparison with how many Switches have been sold, because many users don't report or notice issues and many others never experience issues whatsoever. Without a clear understanding of the problem and little clarity given from Nintendo's end, Joy-Con drift is a murky issue that's hard to tell exactly how serious it actually is, and which is partly by design, no doubt. Either way, considering the expense of Joy-Con controllers, the awkward, slow nature of repairs during a pandemic, and Nintendo's relative silence on the issue, regardless of how many Switch users are actually impacted by the issue, it's safe to say Joy-Con drift has evolved from problem into controversy. Accordingly, it's not hard to see how these kinds of issues can lead to lawsuits. And considering the target audience of Nintendo products, any hardware defect is liable to just hurt, frustrate, and disappoint children. So, how do Joy-Cons, the Nintendo Switch, and controller drift hardware problems relate to a kid suing Nintendo? In October of 2020, a class action lawsuit against Nintendo was filed in Northern California by a woman named Luz Sanchez, alongside her young son. The complaint described how Sanchez had purchased her son a Switch in December of 2018, but that within a month the controllers began drifting. Less than a year later, Sanchez claims the Joy-Con drift had become so pronounced the console wasn't usable anymore. So Sanchez purchased another set of Joy-Cons for her son. Unfortunately, a mere 7 months later, these replacement Joy-Cons had also experienced drift. Sanchez argues that a product with a major defect that undoubtedly affects its value should have had that defect be communicated to prospective buyers before going up for sale. Sanchez is asking for $5,000 in damages, and both Sanchez's lawyers and Nintendo's lawyers have thus far declined to comment on the suit. Looking ahead, it's unclear where this lawsuit will go exactly, and whether or not Sanchez will actually win and be awarded anything. But independent of the outcome of the suit itself, a kid and his mother suing Nintendo for selling them a broken product they couldn't even replace at cost to them is not a good look for the longtime family-friendly gaming company. However, this is not particularly surprising when you think about how Nintendo has responded to the entire larger problem of Joy-Con drift over the years, since the launch of the Switch. If you thought there was a chance Nintendo responded quickly and efficiently, recalling damaged devices and issuing refunds and replacements for whoever, well, we have some bad news. Nintendo's reputation is fairly sterling. It's unimpeachable, or so it would seem on most corners of the internet. Nintendo fans are a passionate, loyal bunch, precisely because of Nintendo's long track record of producing quality hardware, quality games, and even having excellent customer service. This has not been the case in terms of Joy-Con drift, unfortunately. For the longest time in the beginning, Nintendo refused to in any way acknowledge Joy-Con drift was an issue, let alone acknowledge the seriousness of the issue and outline a plan to address the problem. In July of 2019, years after the Switch launched, Nintendo took a better stance when over a dozen Switch owners filed another class action lawsuit over Joy-Con drift and began to fix Joy-Cons for free and out of warranty for all Switch owners. Nintendo's president, Shintaro Furukawa, apologized for any trouble caused to Nintendo's customers, but noted that pending active litigation, he couldn't comment further on the issue. Ultimately, Nintendo's response has been lackluster. For years there was nothing, and now there's a slow way to get the product you paid for that shouldn't fail to be fixed. And other than that, Nintendo hasn't outlined any plans to actually fix whatever design flaw causes JoyCon drift. So even if you get your Joy-Cons fixed, really you're just playing the waiting game until your Joy-Cons inevitably once again begin to drift. It's better than nothing, sure, and maybe there wasn't some kind of massive internal conspiracy where hardware defects were concealed, but nonetheless, people's devices are not worthy of the Nintendo seal of quality that used to mean so much. What's more unfortunate is that this is not even the first time Nintendo has been sued by a kid. For a video games company that started as a greeting card maker and then moved on to produce lighthearted, adventurous, and family-friendly video game experiences often packaged in upbeat, colorful boxes and shells, Nintendo has historically been a much more litigious company than you might expect at a glance. In the world of, shall we say, business politics, like companies illegally selling or reselling Nintendo products, fan games and mods, emulation and more, Nintendo has always been ready and willing to let their lawyers earn their retainers. Ultimately, not so many of their battles in the courtroom directly impact the consumer in a major way, so largely any bad vibes a steady stream of lawsuits might give off has been avoided by Nintendo. However, even setting these kinds of lawsuits aside, Nintendo has been sued by a kid before. Way back when, in 1990, another kid, with the help of an adult, sued not just Nintendo, but also Major League Baseball, because the MLB game he bought for his Nintendo console, a game that cost $40 at that, didn't live up to his expectations. Though it's fair to note that this lawsuit was obviously somewhat spurious, and the much more serious issue of Joy-Con drifting does deserve attention and possibly even repercussions, depending on what the actual situation behind the scenes was and has been regarding Joy-Con drift. To that end, Nintendo's lackluster performance in handling Joy-Con drift isn't just embarrassing in of itself, it's embarrassing in the context of other major gaming console defects. Another major console manufacturer, Microsoft, had a much worse problem with the Xbox 360, but managed to do a much better job of handling it. The most major gaming console hardware failure in history happened not too long ago, only a few generations behind, beginning back in 2005 with the release of Microsoft's Xbox 360. You see, the Xbox released a year before the PlayStation 3, jump-starting the console's success in the market and giving the Xbox an early lead over the PlayStation. However, to make that release date, Microsoft pulled out all the stops and produced as many devices as fast as they could without giving them as rigorous a quality assurance screening as they could have. As you'll likely recall, this led to almost comically widespread failure in the form of the infamous Red Ring of Death. If you thought the Red Ring of Death was just a cute misnomer to describe a simple problem, unfortunately that was not the case. The Red Ring of Death actually meant death, as in repair or replacement for your console was now required. Many users had not just an Xbox die on them, but multiple Xboxes die on them. In the wake of the technological devastation, Microsoft eventually made a radical, unprecedented move. They extended the 360's warranty and they promised to repair or replace all affected consoles. The cost of this has been estimated at a staggering $1 billion. This cost was staggering for Microsoft, who was and is a much larger and more profitable company than Nintendo has ever been. While the Joy-Con problems are thankfully nowhere near as severe as the Red Ring of Death, Microsoft's consumer-friendly moves made the Red Ring of Death much more manageable, and came out the other side largely smelling of roses when their own incompetence caused the problem in the first place. This is where Nintendo could and perhaps should take some notes. Where does this all leave us? Unfortunately, the simple fact of the matter is that since it has now been over 3 years since the Switch launched, and there has been no meaningful addressal of the issue, suggests Nintendo isn't going to do the right thing on its own. It's possible lawsuits and simple public opinion could pressure them into doing more if the outcry became loud enough. But it seems more likely that the issue will instead be quietly addressed in a new version of the Switch. The long-rumored Switch Pro refresh will supposedly offer better performance and higher resolutions than the original Switch. And if there is indeed a new Switch product coming, it would make sense any redesign would include a new take on the Joy-Cons for improved durability. If this turns out to be the case, however, the millions and millions of Nintendo Switch users out there will be left in the lurch. Though it's important to remember that if this is an issue with the Joy-Con and not with the Switch itself, it's possible an updated Joy-Con could eventually be sold alongside the Switch Pro, and this Joy-Con could fix the drift issue and be backwards compatible with earlier Switches. Though if it's a more serious problem that can't be addressed with an update or a replacement Joy-Con, it's likely that the only course of action Switch owners will have is to inevitably repair or replace Joy-Cons that drift. Have you ever experienced Joy-Con drift? Do you think this lawsuit is fair? Or is it another frivolous lawsuit brought for more publicity than merit? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you like this video, make sure to go ahead and subscribe to us here at TheGamer, and ring that notification bell to be updated whenever we post a new video. Thanks for watching.